The lobby smelled like pressed suits and ambition. 43 candidates sat in rows, portfolios on their laps, shoulders squared, eyes tracking the room with the careful alertness of people who had prepared for this. Each one had rehearsed something, a handshake, an opening line, the exact degree of confidence that Red is earned rather than performed. This was an Ironridge Defense Group, PTI, ground floor, a closed-door selection for the most protected role in the building. Executive Military Assistant to CEO Serena Voss, the kind of position that didn't get posted on job boards, the kind that came with a salary that could change the shape of a life.
Are we leaving, Dad?
The revolving door turned. A man walked in. Wrinkled shirt, a backpack so worn the left strap had been knotted back together with paracord. One hand around the handle of a small rolling bag, the other hand holding a 6-year-old girl who clutched a white stuffed rabbit against her chest. One ear up, one ear slightly flattened from years of being held exactly like that. No portfolio, no assistant, no prepared expression. The room went quiet for exactly 1 second. Then someone laughed. "This is not a daycare," a man in the third row said, not quietly. "Wrong building," said another. Drake Holt, head of security, 40 pounds of institutional authority carried in his posture, looked down at the registration sheet. Looked up. Let the silence do the work before he spoke. "Single dad," he said, applying for a combat-adjacent role. The little girl tightened her grip on her father's hand. "Are we leaving, Daddy?" she whispered. The man didn't look at her. Didn't look at Drake. Didn't look at the room. He looked straight ahead at the elevator bank at the far end of the lobby, like he was calculating something nobody else in the building could see. "Not yet, baby." Who's already survived the worst thing and kept going anyway. They laughed at him. They looked through him. They put him last on every list. He let them. Because he already knew something the room didn't. The most dangerous person was never the loudest one, and the strongest kind of love wasn't the kind that needed an audience. Andrew Merritt had been awake since 4:30. Not because of nerves. He didn't get nervous the way he used to. That part of him had gone quiet sometime in the 3rd year after Elena died, like a circuit that had simply stopped drawing power. He'd been awake because Nora had coughed twice in her sleep, and he'd stood in the doorway of her room for 11 minutes, counting her breaths, running the math he ran every night now. The surgery would cost $41,000. His savings account had $612. So he'd ironed the least wrinkled shirt he owned, knotted the broken strap on his backpack, and driven 40 minutes through the dark to a building he'd found at midnight. Ironridge Defense Group. Open selection. No prior application required. Salary commensurate with experience, which, in the fine print, meant a number that had made him sit very still at his kitchen table for a long moment. He hadn't told Nora where they were going. She'd grabbed Pepper, her white stuffed rabbit companion since age 2, one ear permanently soft from years of being carried everywhere, and climbed into the car without asking questions. She was 6. She trusted him the way children trust people who have never given them a reason not to. That was the part that kept his jaw tight the whole drive over. He signed his name at the registration table, found a seat near the wall, not the back corner, not the front, a position that gave him sightlines to 3 exits and the elevator bank without making it obvious that's what he'd chosen. Nora settled beside him, opened her small notebook, and began to draw with the focused intensity she brought to everything she considered important. If I don't make it past the first round, he thought, watching the room arrange itself around him, I'll find something else. This isn't where I belong. He glanced at Nora. She was drawing what appeared to be a house with a very large rabbit standing in the doorway. One round, he told himself. Just see what the first round is. On the 14th floor, behind 3 monitors and a cold cup of coffee, Serena Voss was doing what she always did during these things, watching the room, not the candidates. She had built Ironridge's security division from a 40-person unit into a 400-person operation in 6 years. She'd done it by learning one thing early. The most dangerous person in any room was almost never the loudest one. She watched the lobby feed now. 43 people, most of them performing some version of readiness. Shoulders back, eyes moving to the door each time it opened. A few had already introduced themselves to each other, working the room, building alliances before anything had started. She watched Drake Holt move through the space below, clipboard in hand, radiating the confidence of a man who believed he'd already decided the outcome. He had suggested 3 candidates for the position before she'd opened the selection. All 3 were credentialed. All 3 had histories she could verify. All 3 left her with a mild, persistent unease she couldn't locate the source of. So she'd overridden him, which Drake had not liked. He'd said it professionally, but she'd seen it in the pause before he spoke, that half-second where a man decides how much of his reaction to show. She was still thinking about that pause when the revolving door opened again, and a man walked in with a wrinkled shirt and a 6-year-old daughter and a backpack held together with knotted cord. She leaned forward slightly. She didn't look away. The first test began 20 minutes after registration closed. Footage. Daniel Morn, Unroll, Tata Charge Ready, Adbutarawan Tancho, Medarid. 47 seconds. A simulated lobby, different building, different layout. 3 visible figures moving through the space. The candidates were given 3 minutes to identify the primary threat. The answers came quickly. Most pointed to the agitated figure near the entrance. Logical. Textbook. 2 candidates identified the person at the reception desk. One man gave a thorough breakdown of all 3 subjects, cross-referenced against established threat matrices, and seemed quietly satisfied when he finished. Andrew asked to see the footage again. A few heads turned. Drake, standing at the side wall, made a note. Andrew watched it a second time. The figures. The edges. The negative space between things. The upper left corner, where a glass panel beside the elevator caught a reflection that none of the 3 actors had produced. When the evaluator called on him, he didn't stand. "You're not testing threat detection," he said. The evaluator waited. "You're testing whether we watch the room." A pause. Or the screen. Silence. "Explain," the evaluator said. Andrew pointed to the frozen frame, the corner, the reflection, the 4th presence nobody had named. "The real threat isn't the one moving," he said. "It's the one waiting for you to look away." The room held that for a moment in the particular way rooms hold things they haven't decided what to do with yet. On the 14th floor, Serena's hand stopped moving over her keyboard. She leaned forward until her forearms rested on the desk. She didn't move for a long time. Drake wrote inconclusive, possible prior knowledge of footage setup on his clipboard. He assigned Andrew to Group D, lowest resource allocation, highest elimination rate. Lucky guess, he told himself. He moved on. The break between rounds lasted 15 minutes. Nora had found a stripe of morning light near the end of the east corridor, a low window running along the base of the building, and was sitting in it cross-legged, Pepper propped beside her, working on her notebook with the serious concentration she gave to things she considered worth doing properly. Andrew sat on the bench behind her. He heard the comment before he'd fully settled. The man from the third row, voice carrying without effort, pitched for an audience. Imagine bringing your kid to a job interview. Some people really don't know their place. His hand tightened on his knee. Once, B. Then, release. Nora looked up at him. She had her mother's eyes, that particular shade of brown that caught light strangely, amber at the edges, impossible to look at in certain light without feeling it somewhere behind the sternum. "Daddy," she said, "are those people mean?" He slid off the bench and crouched down to her level, eye to eye. "Some people talk loud because they're scared, baby. That's all." She considered this with the gravity she brought to most things. Scared of what? Of not being seen. She looked back at her notebook, drew another line, deep, then without looking up. "We see them, though." Andrew looked at his daughter for a moment longer than he intended. "Yeah," he said. "We do. We." He didn't notice the woman who had stopped in the corridor behind him. She had a tablet under one arm and a lanyard that read Weston, C. Dolby, Executive Operation. She had been walking somewhere with purpose. She wasn't anymore. Claire had almost kept going. She had 3 things to deliver before the second round and no room for detours. But something in the man's register had stopped her. Not the words themselves, but the absence of anything performed in them. The way he'd said it like it was just true. Not like he was trying to teach something or be overheard. She pulled up the registration feed on her tablet. Found the name. Try. Merritt, Andrew, Group D. 3 weeks ago, a text from a number she'd saved under web. Do not delete. If a man named Andrew Merritt shows up at the selection, pay attention. Don't ask me why yet. She hadn't asked. General Marcus Webb didn't send messages without reason. He also didn't explain himself before he was ready. She walked over, kept her voice level. Merritt, Group D? He stood, met her eyes without urgency. That's right. Claire Weston, Executive Operations. A glance at the tablet, then back. You're in the afternoon rotation for round 2, West Corridor, second door. He nodded. She turned to leave. Stopped. One thing, she said, without fully turning back. Someone's going to ask where you position yourself in a room, in the group session. Just answer honestly. Don't think about what sounds right. She walked away before he could respond. The question came 20 minutes later, thrown from a candidate 2 seats over, the well-built man who filled out his jacket and seemed to know it. Where do you usually position yourself? In a room like this? Andrew looked around. Not performing the look. Actually looking. The door, the windows, the people between him and both. Wherever no one's looking, he said. The man waited for more. There wasn't any more. Andrew turned back to the front of the room, and the session moved on, and the man decided the answer hadn't meant anything. He was wrong, but no one in that room knew it yet. The second round was announced at 11:14. Physical response. Combat reflex evaluation. Mandatory for all remaining candidates. The pairings went up in the order Drake read them. Most were reasonable, matched by build, by background, by logic that at least looked like fairness. Then Drake said, Callahan, Merritt. Brock Callahan was hard to miss. 253 pounds, structured through years of deliberate work. 3 regional MMA championships, 2 of which he hadn't bothered listing on his application because he considered them warm-up material. He had the settled stillness of a man who had never once walked into a physical situation and wondered how it would end. He looked at Andrew the way you look at something when you're deciding if it warrants attention. He decided it didn't. He looked away. That was worse than anything he could have said. Andrew felt it, not as insult, but as data. Drake had built this pairing the way you build a message. Quick exit. Clean embarrassment. Duh. One less variable. He thought about Nora in the corridor with her notebook. Pepper sitting beside her on the tile, one ear up, button eyes patient and steady. The way she'd looked at him that morning when he'd said, "Get your shoes." "Are we going somewhere important, Daddy?" And he'd said maybe because he hadn't known how to say "I need this to work," or "I don't know what comes next." He stood up when his name was called. Drake wants me out fast, he thought. Fine, Daddy. But not today. The assessment room was a cleared space on the second floor. Padded floor, high ceiling, 4 cameras at the corners. 12 candidates on benches along the wall. Drake near the door, clipboard in hand, expression professionally neutral. The evaluator gave the standard brief. Controlled engagement. Stop on signal. Brock rolled his shoulders, settled into his stance. Andrew stood across from him, hands loose at his sides, face giving nothing away. Not confidence, not apprehension. Just a man in a room, present and waiting. The signal came. Brock moved first. Clean combinations, properly weighted, built on 10,000 hours of repetition. He closed the distance fast. His reach advantage was real, and he used it the way he always used it, with the certainty of someone who had never had it fail. It didn't land. Andrew wasn't where the strike was going. Not a dramatic movement. Not a counter. Just not there. A small shift, a redirection of weight, and Brock's momentum carried fractionally past where it expected to arrive. Brock reset. Came again. Harder. The contact didn't happen. 10 seconds. 15. The room had started quiet and stayed quiet, but the quality of the silence changed. People leaned forward without noticing. Something was building at the edge of Brock's focus, a frustration he couldn't locate, because the man across from him wasn't doing anything. Wasn't pressing, wasn't countering, wasn't giving him a pattern to work against. Just moving. Small, jangy, continuous, like water finding the path that wasn't there until it was. He's reading me, Brock realized, somewhere around the 20-second mark. He's been reading me since we started. Second, 26. Andrew moved, once, the way you move when the calculation is already finished and you're only executing the final step. One hand on Brock's forearm, a shift in his own center, a controlled redirection of 253 pounds of committed forward momentum. The floor came up. Brock lay on his back looking at the ceiling. He ran it back in his head. Which joint, which balance point, the exact sequence. He couldn't isolate it. Which meant whoever had just put him down had been operating at a level of technical precision he hadn't encountered outside of. He sat up. Oh! Met Andrew's eyes. Andrew was standing exactly where he'd been, hands back at his sides, not breathing hard, not performing anything at all. Something shifted in Brock's chest, not pride, not anger. Something cleaner than both. He nodded once. Andrew nodded back. Neither spoke. The evaluator made a mark and called the next pair. The room moved on, but something had changed in the air of it, in a way that couldn't be unchanged. Drake pressed his pen harder against the clipboard than he needed to. On the 14th floor, Serena said 2 words to Claire, who was standing at her left shoulder. Pull his file, the real one. I already started looking, Claire said. Claire stepped into the corridor and called the number from memory. Webb picked up on the second ring. Merritt, she said. Just that. A pause, not surprise. Consideration. What? He was the best operator I ever commanded. Webb's voice had the flatness of someone who had learned to keep feeling out of sentences. He left because the system failed his wife, not because he failed the system. What happened to her? Internal intelligence failure. Wrong location passed up the chain. She was there because someone gave bad data and nobody caught it. A pause. He caught it 3 hours after. Claire said nothing. Files in your secure folder, Webb said. Has been since this morning. The file was 11 pages, most of it redacted to abstraction, black bars over names, locations, dates. But the shape of a career was still visible underneath. Delta Force. Black Operations. Assignments that didn't have official names. The outline of someone who had worked at a level most people in that building would never be cleared to know about. And at the bottom of page 11, in plain, unredacted text, voluntarily discharged. Reason: internal intelligence failure resulting in civilian casualty, his wife. Serena read it twice, set it down, picked it up again. She had spent 18 months sensing something wrong inside Ironridge, not wrong in a way she could name yet, but wrong the way a room feels different when someone has been through it. Small inconsistencies. Information arriving slightly altered. Recommendations that served interests she hadn't authorized. Drake's recommendations. She looked at the file, then at the monitor, where Andrew was walking back into the main room, Nora falling into step beside him from the corridor, the small white rabbit tucked under the girl's arm. He understands what it means when the system fails from inside, she thought. He's the only person in that building today who does. She set the file down and looked at the city beyond her window for a long moment. And he stayed anyway. The third round began at 2 o'clock. VIP protection simulation. A structured scenario on the 3rd floor, escalating threat conditions. 40 minutes to keep a designated target secure. Andrew ran the exercise. He ran it well, better than well, though he didn't use his full range, and the evaluator couldn't have known what he was holding back. Because part of his attention was elsewhere. He noticed the camera lag at minute 4. A 4-second delay between motion and feed update. Not a bandwidth problem. The compression pattern was wrong. Someone had introduced the lag deliberately. Enough to create a blind window. Not enough to register as a system fault unless you knew what you were looking for. At minute 7, 2 candidates in his group wearing access badges in a color that didn't match their stated clearance tier. Small differential. Easy to miss. Andrew had spent 4 years in environments where badge color was the difference between an asset and a threat. At minute 9, the VIP placement. The designated target had been positioned at a precise location, the exact gap between camera 3 and camera 7 in the live Ironridge security grid. Not the simulation grid, the building's real camera architecture, which he'd mapped during the lunch break out of habit. The way he mapped every building he spent more than an hour inside. Someone had designed this scenario using access to the actual building's layout. That wasn't something an external vendor did. He finished the exercise, received his score, and in the 30 seconds while everyone looked at the evaluator, he typed 9 words into his phone and sent them to the number Webb had given him 6 months ago. Keep this. Don't ask me why yet. Shadow pattern confirmed. Ironridge has a leak. He pocketed the phone. He did not look at Drake. He looked through the corridor window at Nora, still in the hallway, working on her drawing, Pepper propped against the wall beside her like a small and patient guardian. 3 floors up, Claire's phone moved. She read the message. Then she was already moving toward the elevator, the printed file under her arm, Webb's words still settled in the back of her mind. Pay attention. She finally understood why. The message arrived at 9:47. Andrew had been in the ground floor waiting area for 2 hours, sitting with bad coffee and the quiet specific to buildings after hours. That particular emptiness when the machinery of a place has stopped, but the place itself is still present. The selection was officially over. Results tomorrow morning, Drake had announced, before the remaining candidates filed out. Andrew had asked Claire if he could stay. She'd said yes without asking why. What she didn't say was that she'd arranged for 2 security staff she trusted, not Drake's people, to remain in the building. Andrew hadn't asked about that either. Some things you understand without needing them explained. Nora was asleep on 2 chairs he'd pushed together, a spare jacket, Claire's he realized, laid over her at some point in the evening. One small shoe had fallen off. Her arm was wrapped around Pepper's middle. Her breathing was slow and even. The message was 4 words. Executive floor cameras down. Not one camera. Not a section. All of them. Simultaneously. 9:46. Andrew sat with it for 3 seconds. The board meeting was at 8 tomorrow morning. Raymond Steele had been maneuvering toward Ironridge for 14 months through channels that kept not quite working. Serena Voss was on the 14th floor. He'd confirmed this through Claire an hour ago. And Drake Holt had just made the entire executive corridor invisible. He stood up. Through the glass panel of the waiting room, Nora shifted in her sleep. Her lips moved. Pepper wants to go home, Daddy. Not fully awake, just present enough to say it. He stepped inside, pulled the jacket up to her shoulder, crouched beside her for a moment in the dark, close enough to hear her breathe. The shoe that had fallen off was a small white sneaker with a Velcro strap she'd learned to fasten herself 3 months ago and considered a significant personal achievement. After this, he thought, I promise. He didn't say it out loud. He let it sit in his chest where promises live when you mean them completely and can't afford to look at them directly right now. He stood, walked back into the corridor. He'd been in the building for 14 hours. He knew 3 stairwells. He knew which one Drake's people weren't using, because he'd watched the rotation twice and it had a pattern, and patterns were the thing he'd spent the better part of a decade learning to read. He also had no access credentials for the executive floor. He'd known that since morning. He'd been waiting to solve that problem when it became necessary. At 9:51, it became necessary. A man in a gray jacket came around the corner of the east corridor, moving toward the service stairwell. Andrew recognized him before he was close enough to see his face, the posture, the cadence, the badge on his lanyard in a color he'd cataloged 6 hours ago in a simulation room on the third floor. Not a candidate. Never had been. The man didn't see Andrew until 4 feet of distance remained. By then, there was nothing useful left to do about it. 10 seconds. No sound. Andrew lowered him carefully to the floor, the kind of careful that comes from long practice, making sure the weight arrived without impact. He took the lanyard, checked the badge tier. Executive access. All floors. He clipped it to his collar and walked to the stairwell door. The 14th floor corridor was dim, amber after-hours lighting, low and even. Both cameras in the section between the stairwell and the executive conference room were dark. The indicator lights that should have pulsed green were simply off. Drake had been thorough. He just hadn't considered the possibility that someone already inside the building knew what thorough looked like from the outside. The second man was stationed at the bend in the corridor. He heard the stairwell door and turned. Andrew was already most of the way to him. It was quiet. It was fast. He set the man against the wall with the same practiced care as before. Not kindness, but the efficiency of someone who had learned that unnecessary damage created unnecessary complication. He stood at the conference room door. Through the narrow glass panel, the long table, the city beyond the floor-to-ceiling window, 3 figures. Serena standing, posture controlled, in the way of someone who has decided not to show what they're feeling, which meant she was feeling quite a lot. Raymond Steele across the table, one hand resting on a document, patient with the ease of a man who believes the outcome is already written. Drake positioned behind Serena's left shoulder, holding a thick folder. Not her security, her obstacle. Steele's voice came through the door, muffled but clear enough. "Sign it, Serena." A pause designed to feel generous. "Or tomorrow's board meeting will be very uncomfortable for you." Serena's hands were flat on the table. She didn't move toward the document. Andrew opened the door. He didn't rush it. Rushing changed the acoustics of a room, told people something was wrong before they'd finished deciding how to respond. He walked in at a pace that said he belonged there. Drake turned first. Looked at Andrew the way you look at a variable that wasn't supposed to exist. "You don't belong here," Drake said. Andrew looked at him steadily. "Neither do you." 1 second. Then Steele made a small 2-finger gesture. Prearranged, clean, and the men along the far wall moved. They were professionals. They moved like it. Andrew moved like something else entirely. 15 seconds. Specific and economic, targeting balance and leverage rather than pain, because pain makes noise. The first man went down on his right side. The second into the wall, and then the floor. Neither got back up. Then Drake came. This was different. Drake had real training, field experience, and 14 hours of watching Andrew to draw from. He'd calculated the angles. He closed the distance hard, and he landed twice. Once at the ribs, once at the right shoulder, with enough force that something flared bright and specific in the joint. Andrew filed it away, moved through it. Pain is information, he thought. Information is useful. Don't stop moving. He ended it the way he'd ended things since the first time someone taught him how. not by overpowering, but by removing the conditions that made the other person's strategy work. Drake needed footing. Andrew took it. Drake needed reach. Andrew collapsed the distance until reach became a liability. Drake went down. He didn't get up. Andrew stood in the middle of the conference room. His right shoulder was delivering a very clear and specific message that he was choosing not to fully receive yet. He looked at Serena. She was still standing where she'd been. She hadn't moved during any of it. Not back, not toward the door. She'd stood and watched with the focused attention of someone recording every detail for a report she'd be writing later. Her hands were no longer flat on the table. One of them was holding its edge. Not tightly. Just holding. She looked at him. He looked at her. For a moment, the city lights through the window were the only things in the room doing anything at all. Serena reached across the table, picked up Steele's contract, Clause 9, the document that would have handed Ironridge to someone else's decisions by 8 tomorrow morning. She turned it face down without signing it. She looked back at Andrew. "You weren't hired yet," she said. His shoulder was burning. He kept his face level. "No," he said. "I wasn't." The authorities arrived at 10:23, called by Claire from the stairwell. Steele was escorted out with the quietness of a man who had decided cooperation was his only remaining currency. Drake left separately. At the door, he looked at Andrew once, an expression that wasn't anger anymore, something closer to recognition. Too late, but real. The building emptied again. The conference room cleared. Claire suggested Andrew and Nora stay the night. There would be statements in the morning, and Nora was already asleep, and moving her now seemed unkind. Andrew accepted without discussion. Claire had arranged for a cot in the waiting room before she asked, which told him everything he needed to know about her. He sat in the waiting area with his shoulder in his thoughts and the quiet of a building that had come very close to becoming something else. He didn't sleep much. That was fine. He hadn't expected to. Nora woke at 7:14, all at once, present and operational, the way she always woke. She sat up on the pushed-together chairs, looked at the jacket, looked at the room, looked at her father, looked at his shoulder. Her eyes went wide and still. "Daddy, die." She climbed down, crossed the room to him. "You got hurt." "Just a scratch, baby." She stood in front of him and studied the bandaging with an expression of focused skepticism she had inherited directly from her mother. Then she reached out and placed her hand on his forearm, just below the injury, very gently, like she was checking whether he was real. "Does it hurt?" He looked at her, at the amber light in her eyes, at the way she was holding herself, trying to be steady for him at 6 years old, because she could see he needed it. "A little," he said, "but okay. She considered this, weighed it with the seriousness she gave to things that mattered, nodded once, like she was accepting a report from a source she had reason to trust. Then she turned, picked up Pepper, and placed the rabbit carefully in his lap. "Pepper makes things hurt less," she said. A statement of established fact, offered without fanfare, set in the room to simply be true. Andrew looked down at the small white rabbit, one ear up, one ear slightly flattened, button eyes patient and steady in the morning light, worn soft from years of being carried everywhere by someone who loved it without reservation. Something moved in his chest. He didn't try to name it. He heard the door at 7:41. Serena stopped in the threshold. She had the official appointment letter in her hand, printed, signed, the document that gave everything that had happened yesterday, a title and a salary and a start date. She'd come to deliver it before the board meeting. Practical, duh. The kind of thing she handled herself because she'd learned not to delegate what mattered. She stood at the doorway and looked at the room. Andrew in the chair, Claire working on the second layer of his bandage with quiet efficiency, Nora standing beside him with one small hand resting on his knee, watching Claire work with the focused attention she gave to things she wanted to understand properly. Pepper sitting in Andrew's lap facing the door, patient as ever. Serena didn't move. Nora heard her first, turned around. She assessed Serena with the open, uncalculating directness that only very young children and very old people still allowed themselves. "Are you the lady Daddy works for now?" Serena's mouth opened slightly. Then, a pause. "I think so, yes." Nora processed this with a small nod. Then she turned and ran to the chair where her notebook had spent the night, grabbed it, flipped to the right page, and ran back. She held it up. Crayon lines, the particular unsteadiness of a 6-year-old working with care. A tall figure on the left, dark-haired, a small backpack. A shorter figure in the middle, round face, something white tucked under one arm. A figure on the right with long hair and very straight posture. And in the corner, small and deliberate, a white rabbit with one ear up and one ear at a softer angle. "I drawed us," Nora said. "Pepper says it's okay if you join." Serena looked at the drawing. She looked at it for a long time. Not at the lines or the colors. At the fact of it, that this child had put her in the picture before knowing anything about her. Had given her a place in the frame, without asking what she was worth, or what she controlled, or what joining anything would cost. Had drawn her into a family the way children draw things, because it seemed right, and that was enough. Nobody had done that in a very long time. Serena wasn't certain anyone ever had. Her thumb moved slightly against the edge of the appointment letter. Just once. "Thank you," she said quietly, completely, sincerely, to a 6-year-old. Nora nodded like this was the appropriate response and turned back to show Claire the rest of the notebook. Serena set the letter on the table in front of Andrew and sat across from him. He read it fully, every page, every clause, the sections designed to look like formatting. It took 4 minutes. Claire and Nora's quiet conversation about Pepper's color preferences filled the room behind him. He looked up. "The salary covers Nora's surgery." Not a question. The confirmation of a calculation he'd been running since 4:30 the previous morning, when he'd sat at his kitchen table with a number on a screen and let himself believe, carefully, that it might be possible. Serena held his gaze. Yes. He picked up the pen, signed his name in the space at the bottom, unhurried, the signature of someone who has decided completely. The lobby was quiet at 8:15. Staff had arrived and dispersed to their floors. The selection candidates were long gone, almost all of them. Brock Callahan was near the main entrance, bag over one shoulder, waiting for a car. He'd given a brief statement to the responding officers the night before. He'd still been in the building when everything happened. One of several candidates asked to remain, and stayed at a hotel 2 blocks over, rather than make the drive home at midnight. He heard the elevator open. Andrew came out alone, jacket on, bag over his left shoulder, the right side carried slightly careful. He crossed the lobby without looking around. Brock straightened. Andrew saw him, slowed, stopped. They looked at each other across 12 feet of lobby floor. Brock nodded once. Andrew nodded back. Brock's car arrived. He walked out into the morning without another word, and the lobby was quiet again, and everything that needed to be said between them had been said, because some conversations don't require language. The board meeting ended at 10:50. Ironridge remained Ironridge. The afternoon moved through the building the way afternoons do. Meetings, decisions, the ordinary ongoing life of a company that had woken that morning, not knowing how close it had come to being something entirely different. At 4:30, Serena walked toward the elevator bank at the end of the 14th floor corridor. She heard a step behind her. One step back. Precise. She didn't turn around. "You're supposed to walk beside me," she said. "Not behind me." A pause. "That's not how shadows work." She stopped. She stood still with the elevator ahead of her, and the corridor quiet around her, and the city doing what cities do in the late afternoon, all of it indifferent and continuous beyond the glass. She thought about a man in a wrinkled shirt looking at an elevator bank like he was calculating something no one else could see. She thought about a 6-year-old placing a stuffed rabbit in her father's lap like it was medicine. She thought about a drawing with 4 figures in it, made by someone who hadn't asked permission before putting her in the frame. She started walking again, a little slower than before. Down on the ground floor, in the side waiting room, Nora was explaining to Claire why Pepper preferred blue to red. It was a detailed explanation with supporting evidence. Claire was listening to every word of it with the full and genuine attention she gave to things that mattered. Andrew saw them through the glass panel as he passed the doorway. He stopped. One step behind, he thought, far enough back to see everything, close enough that nothing in the room could be touched without going through him first. He'd carried that as a philosophy for 3 years, told himself it was the most honest description of what he was, a man who stood at the edges of things, who watched rather than belonged, who kept people safe by staying just outside the frame. He looked at his daughter, laughing at something Claire had said. Pepper on the table between them, one ear up. The afternoon light coming through the low window, the same way it had that morning, when Nora had found her stripe of sun and sat in it without being told. He looked at the empty space beside her, the space a crayon drawing had already filled in, on a page in a notebook, before any of today had been decided. One step behind, he thought again, enough to see everything, enough to keep them safe. For the first time in 3 years, it didn't sound like being alone. Some people walk into a room and demand to be seen. Andrew Merritt walked in and chose to see everyone else. He didn't come to prove anything. He came because a 6-year-old girl needed surgery, and he had $600 and no other options. He came wearing a knotted backpack and a wrinkled shirt and the quiet, unshakable certainty of a man who has already survived the worst thing and kept going anyway. "Oh, him!" They laughed at him. They looked through him. They put him last on every list. He let them, because he already knew something the room didn't. The most dangerous person was never the loudest one, and the strongest kind of love wasn't the kind that needed an audience. It was the kind that woke at 4:30 and did the math, that crouched down to eye level in a corridor and told the truth gently. that placed a stuffed rabbit in someone's lap and called it medicine. You don't have to be the loudest person in the room. You don't have to be the most impressive one. Sometimes all you have to be is the one who keeps showing up for the people who are counting on you. One quiet step at a time. If Andrew's story stayed with you, drop a comment and tell me which moment hit hardest. Was it Nora and Pepper? The lobby? DMT? That last line? I read every single one, and your words are genuinely what keeps these stories coming. Like and subscribe if you want more. There are quiet people doing extraordinary things, and they deserve to be seen.